Sometimes Christians get it right, or at least more right than others. One of the things I do in these videos is critique Christian teaching, not just Christian practice. Many people point to the high degree of hypocrisy within the church, the contrast between what it teaches and what it actually does in practice. Many, if not most, of these criticisms are entirely justified. In themselves, though, they are not enough to warrant abandonment of the Christian mythology. All they serve to demonstrate is that Christians often don't actually practice Christianity. My critique tries to go somewhat deeper. I critique and reject the mythology itself for various reasons. I've covered several examples in the course of making these videos. I always frame Christian beliefs in terms of mythology, the stories that are told that are intended to shape our behaviour and to shape our culture and our society. I criticise many aspects of these stories, arguing that they're actually bad stories, in the sense that they result in a faulty interpretation of and a faulty response to the world around us and to each other. So I'm highly critical not just of the practice, but also of the theory of Christianity. However, I don't think that all of the mythology, all of these stories, are harmful and should be rejected. Some of the major stories, yes, such as the whole sin redemption narrative, among other things, these are pretty big parts of the story. There are, however, some areas where the stories Christianity tells are a significant improvement on the stories told in other cultures and other mythologies. And chief among these is the attitude expressed towards children. Now, before you get all outraged and point to the painfully obvious ways in which the church has failed to live up to the values expressed in these stories, of course that's true. Indeed, this enormous gap between theory and practice is one of the major reasons that so many people reject the church, at least, and possibly even the whole Christian teaching. The behaviour towards children of so many people who identify as Christian is, of course, abominable, and all the more egregious precisely because it's so much at odds with the teaching, with the stories. So I'm in no way defending this behaviour, but I am, in fairness to Christianity, willing to admit that the place that children have in its stories represent a significant improvement on the attitudes of surrounding and preceding cultures. In the ancient Greek and Roman world, children were largely regarded as the property of the father. Aristotle explicitly endorses, even wants to see mandated, the practice of exposing children, leaving them out in the wild somewhere, who were deemed physically deficient in some way. In Book 7, Chapter 16 of his Politics, he writes, "As to exposing or rearing the children born, let there be a law that no deformed child shall be reared." In Plutarch's The Life of Lycurgus, he reports that in Sparta, the decision about whether a newborn should be raised or killed was made by a collection of elders. He writes, "When a child was born, it was taken to a place called Lesci, where the elders of the tribe examined it. If the child was well built and strong, they ordered it to be raised, and it was assigned one of the 9,000 lots of land. But if it was weakly and deformed, they ordered it to be thrown into the place called Apothetai, a chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetus." Hebrew law did not explicitly deal with the issue of child exposure of this kind, or indeed of how to deal with children that were regarded as in some way deficient. However, given the general view of children in the Hebrew tradition as a blessing from God who should be valued and protected, along with a lack of any evidence for the practice of exposure, this suggests that this was not widely practiced in Israel and may indeed have been frowned upon. Now, men with physical disabilities were not permitted to take on the role of priest, but there's no suggestion that they were rejected from society in general. In Roman law, there was the principle of patria potestas, father's power, which gave the father, as head of the household, great power over his children, including authority over life and death issues, although this was tempered over time by other laws and customs. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek historian writing about Roman customs, explicitly describes the extent of patria potestas in early Rome, showing that the father's control over his children was near absolute. In Book 2, Chapter 26 of his Roman Antiquities, he writes, "The lawgiver gave virtually full authority to the father over his son, including imprisonment, flogging, keeping him in chains, or even putting him to death. And this right continued as long as the son remained in the father's power." Gaius, a Roman jurist, provides a legal description of patria potestas. In his Institutes, he writes, "The power that we have over our children is peculiar to Roman citizens and is found in no other nation. The power which we have over our children is unique, for there are no other people who have such power as we have over our children." While obviously Hebrew society was patriarchal and the father was seen as the head of the family, there was no such absolute power granted to the father over his children. Children were seen rather as blessings from God and part of the covenant with God, part indeed of the promise of God. And this was also expressed in the practice of circumcision. Now, were children sometimes badly treated in the Old Testament? Yes, of course they were. I'm simply pointing out that the teaching of the Hebrew faith expressed a much more positive attitude towards children than the surrounding cultures, including the Greek and Roman cultures. I think these attitudes are enhanced when we consider the New Testament, and particularly the stories told of Jesus' attitude towards children. For example, in Matthew chapter 18, verses 3 to 5, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." Jesus uses a child here as a symbol of humility and dependence, encouraging his followers to adopt childlike qualities in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. You could argue, of course, that this tends to infantilize adults in terms of their relationship with God. The flip side, though, is that it exalts children into a higher position. In Matthew 18:10, Jesus says, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven." And Matthew 19:14, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." These passages demonstrate Jesus' care for children and his view that they are integral to God's kingdom, that they have a special place in the kingdom. There are other passages in the New Testament which emphasize that children should obey their parents, and we may want to debate the way in which these have been interpreted. But I think the stories told of Jesus with respect to children are very positive and helpful. There are also passages such as this from James chapter 1 verse 27. "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." This emphasizes the moral responsibility the Christian has to take care of children. Now, please don't come at me with comments about how poorly the church and individual Christians have lived up to this ideal. Of course, I'm aware of that. There have also been times, though, when it's worked. And although terrible things have happened in Christian-run orphanages and schools, nevertheless, these institutions were established, at least on the principle of taking care of children. More important to me, though, is the fact that these stories actually exist, and I'm happy for them to inform the way I behave and the way society behaves. I think they're stories worth having within our culture and maintaining within our culture. Hopefully, stories about caring for the outcast and the stranger in general might also gain some traction. Just in conclusion, I reject a large part of the Christian mythology. I see it as actually harmful. However, when I find something good and positive in a particular tradition, such as this, wherever it comes from, I'm more than happy to acknowledge and adopt it. Don't reject the good with the bad.